Hi, welcome to the Gemara on Yud Chet Amud Aleph. We are starting 8 lines up from the bottom of the Amud with a new quote from the Mishnah, Kara Serugin Yatsa. So this is the part of the Mishnah that says that if you read the Megillah starting and stopping, you're still Yotze, you've still fulfilled your obligation. Lo havu yade Rabbanan mai Serugin. The rabbis didn't know what the meaning of the word Serugin was, and Rashi here says that these Rabbanan, the rabbis in question, are the students of Rebbe, the students of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who composed the Mishnah, or redacted the Mishnah, and they didn't know what that word meant. Shamuel la'amatza tebei Rebbe, teka'amra lahu l'Rabbanan, tehavu aile paski lebe Rebbe. So they heard the maidservant of the house of Rebbe. So this was Rebbe's own maidservant, that she was saying to them, to the rabbis, when they were going up little by little, paske, little by little in small groups, into the house of Rebbe. So when they were doing that, she said to them, Ad matayatem nichnasin serugin. Until when will you go in? Serugin. And from this they learned that the word serugin means like starting and stopping little by little. That's how they learned the meaning of the term. Lo havu yade Rabbanan mai chalug logot. Similarly, the students of Rebbe didn't know what this word chalug logot meant. Chalug logot is a word that is used in Tannaitic sources. Rashi actually tells you, min yarek, it's a kind of vegetable. Vishanui bekama mekom Mishnah writes, and it turns up in several places in Tannaitic literature. They didn't know what it was. Shamuel la'amta debei Rebbe, de amrole lahahu gavra, de have kamivader parpachine. So they heard the maidservant of the house of Rebbe say to this guy, hahu gavra, this man, who was scattering parpachine. Parpachine is a vegetable, a green. It's called purslane, and I have a picture of it. Actually, this is what it looks like. It is sometimes considered a weed, and it's also edible. And so that's what it meant. So because she said to him, "Until when will you scatter your purslane?" they knew that that's what the word chalug logot meant. Shamuel amta. Oh, sorry, I read that. So we'll put this in quotes. This is what she said. Okay. Lo havu yade Rabbanan mai salsala utiromameka. They didn't know what this meant. This is actually a quote from Mishlei, these two words. So specifically the word silsala, they didn't know what it meant. And you can see there is a translation here, Proverbs 4:8, extol her and she will exalt you, she'll bring you to honor when you embrace her. So the silsala here is something about extolling or praising, but the rabbis didn't know what that word meant. Shamuel amata debei Rebbe, tehavit amra lahahu gavra, tehav mahapech b'mezayah. They heard the maidservant of the house of Rebbe who said to a certain man when he was kind of twisting and turning his hair, he was like playing with his hair, turning it around. Amrale, she said to him, Ad matayatel misalsel b'sa'arecha. Until when are you going to be misalsel your hair? Like, for how long are you going to keep doing this to your hair? And Rashi tells you, based on this, misalsel b'sa'arecha lamadu sha'silsul lashon chipus v'hifuch. This teaches us the word silsul is like searching and turning it around. That's what silsul means, and they learned this from Rebbe's maidservant, because that's what she said to this guy. So here's another example. Lo havu yade Rabbanan mai hashlech al Hashem yahavecha. They didn't know what this, again, a pasuk meant. They didn't know specifically this word yahavecha. And again, this is, we do have an English translation for this verse. Cast your burden upon God and He'll sustain you. Okay, so from Psalms. So the rabbis felt this was an esoteric word. Amar Rabba bar Chana. So Rabba bar Chana said, Zimna chara hava azilna behadi hahutaya. One time I was traveling together with, Bahadi is together with, this Arab, V'kaderina tuna, and I was carrying a burden. The Amar Li, and he said to me, Shekol Yahavech v'shadi agamlei. So he responded to me, and he said, you can kind of cast off your, throw off your yahavecha, which apparently means burden. So you can throw that off, and put it on my camel. Throw it onto the camel. Lo havu yadei rabbanan, my betate b'matata. So they didn't know, again, b'matata hashmed. They didn't know what this pasuk meant. They didn't know what the words in this pasuk meant. We'll look at this one also from Yeshayahu. So I'll sweep it with the besom of destruction. Okay, whatever. Hashmed. So what does that mean? They didn't know. Shamuel amatzibei Rebbe dahavit amr lechaverta shkulei ta'atita v'ta'atei beta. So they heard her saying to her friend, "Take a broom and sweep the house," and thereby they learned that actually ta'atea means broom and matata means broom, and that's how they learned those words. Tana Rabbanan, we're moving on a little bit. We learned in a Braita, I'll put this in red, Kara serugin yatsa, really just this. If you read in bits and pieces, you fulfilled your obligation. Serusin lo yatsa. But if you read serusin, this other word, then you did not fulfill your obligation. And Rashi tells us serusin means the mafreya. It's the same as out of order. So you're reading pieces, you're reading pieces, you're taking pieces from here and pieces from there, but basically you're reading it out of order. And in that case, you didn't fulfill your obligation. So that's what the Braita says, or that's the ruling here. And it continues, Rimuna Amar Mishum Rabbi Yehuda, Af Beserugin, Im Shaha Kadei Ligmor et Kula, Choser LaRosh. This is the continuation of the Braita. Rabbi Muna says in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, even reading it Serugin, like reading a little bit and stopping and starting, even that, if you wait long enough so that you could finish the whole Megillah, you have to go back to the beginning, meaning that's also not an acceptable way to read. You're not Yotze. Amar Rav Yosef, Halacha K'Rav Muna, She'amar Mishum Rabbi Yehuda. So he says this is actually the halacha. Right? This is Rav Yosef now and Amara saying this is how we paskin, that you can read starting and stopping, but if you wait too long in that starting and stopping kind of place, then that's problematic and you'd have to go back to the beginning. Amar le Abaye le Rav Yosef. So Abaye says to Rav Yosef, Kedei ligmor et kula mehecha dekai l'seifa o dilma miresha l'seifa. Rav Yosef, Abaye wants to know what's the meaning of saying that you have to wait, that the amount of time that it would take to finish it. Does that mean kedei ligmor et kula mehecha dekai l'seifa, in order to finish all of it from wherever he left off till the end, or perhaps from the beginning of the Megillah to the end? In other words, is Rabbi Muna saying that the problem comes when you waited long enough to read the entire Megillah? That's the second possibility here, Miresha L'Seifa, from the beginning to the end. Or is he saying it's a problem if you stopped wherever you were up to, let's say sometime in the middle of chapter 3, the amount of time it would take to get from the middle of chapter 3 to the end, which would obviously be a lesser amount of time. Amar le, so he answered him, Miresha L'Seifa. No, what he had in mind in that Braita was Miresha L'Seifa, reading it from the beginning to the end, reading the whole thing. Because if not, you've given your words over to be split up. This phrase is something that we will talk about more. But it's a kind of rabbinic, it's a common phrase in rabbinic literature, and it means it would be too hard to keep the halacha. Basically, it would be sort of all over the place. because it would be different for everybody, right? Like the amount of time would be different if you stopped in the middle of chapter 4 versus in the middle of chapter 7 versus in the middle of chapter 1. So it's easier to just say, for everyone, it's about the same amount of time, because it's the amount of time that it would take you from beginning to end. So you don't have to worry too much about where you left off. You just say, if you pause long enough that you could have read the whole Megillah in that time, it's not valid and you have to go back to the beginning. Amar Rabbi Abba, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Abba, Amar Rav. So a statement in the name of Rav. Halacha k'Rav Yimuna. So Rav says that the halacha is like Rav Yimuna, similar to what Rav Yosef said. Ushmuel Amar ein halacha k'Rav Yimuna. And Shmuel says, no, the halacha is not actually like Rav Yimuna. It is presumably in the other direction. The first part of the Brayta, which said, it doesn't seem to matter how long you would wait if you're stopping and starting. It doesn't matter how long that would be. Besura matnu hachi. In Surah, that's the way they taught it. Surah, one of the big Torah centers in the time of the Gemara. They taught it as we just said it, meaning that's how they framed the machloket. Pumbedita matnu hachi. But in Pumbedita, a different yeshiva town, they taught it as follows. Amar Rav Kahana Amar Rav, halacha k'Rav Yimuna, u'Shmuel Amar ein halacha k'Rav Yimuna. So they flip it. In this case, Rav is the one who's saying that the halacha, they just have different ideas about who said what. But Rav says halacha k'Rav Yimuna, u'Shmuel Amar ein halacha k'Rav Yimuna. Rav Bibi matne yifcha, and Rav Bibi teaches it the opposite way. So here's where we get to the opposite. Rav Amar ein halacha k'Rav Yimuna, u'Shmuel Amar halacha k'Rav Yimuna. So basically, we have three different versions of the machloket. In this last one, we actually have the positions flipped. So the question is going to be, who holds like Rabbi Yimuna? Is it Rav who holds like Rabbi Yimuna? Or is it Shmuel who holds like Rabbi Yimuna? Again, Rabbi Yimuna's position being that if you stop long enough to read the whole Megillah, you're not Yotzei and you have to go back to the beginning. Amar Rav Yosef. So Rav Yosef is going to offer an answer. Nakot Rav Bibi bi'adcha. D'Shmuel hu t'chayesh li'chida. So nakot is like take. So take Rav Bibi's statement in your hand, meaning Rav Bibi is the one who's actually right. His version of the machloket is correct, because Shmuel is the one who worries about the opinion of the minority of the single position. Rashi explains this a little bit more here. Apparently this is something Shmuel was famous for. In any machloket where, or maybe not any, but in machlokot in general, where the minority position, the single voice, is more machmir, has a more restrictive position, and the larger group is more lenient. In general, Shmuel tends to hold with the minority, the stricter opinion of the minority. And now we're going to prove that this is true. Titnan, as we learn in the Mishnah. So this is a Mishnah from a completely different context, not on anything related to a subject we've been talking about. This is a Mishnah in Yevamot. We're just trying to prove that this, in fact, is Shmuel's pattern in life. So we learn in the Mishnah, Shomeri avam shekidesh achiv, et achota, mishum Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera amru, omrim lo hamten ad she'aseh achitach gadol ma'aseh. This is the beginning of the Mishnah. In order to understand this, you need to know a little bit about Yibum, because we're in Yevamot. So Yibum is the biblically prescribed action when a man and a woman are married, and he dies and she has no children, or he dies and they have had no children together. I should say he hasn't had children with her. If he has brothers, then a brother is supposed to marry this woman and have children who then sort of count as the man who passed away. They sort of count as his children. So a Shomeri Obam is a woman whose husband has died, and one of the brothers of her now deceased husband, one of the brothers of her late husband, has done kiddushin with her sister. Okay, so her late husband's brother is engaged to her sister. And the question is this okay or not? So according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, they say, we say to him, wait until your older brother does something, until he does a ma'aseh, meaning they've already done kiddushin. That's the first stage of marriage, and so they're not fully married yet. And we say to him, you know what? Wait, don't do nisuin until your brother decides whether to either do yibum, meaning marry the woman, marry his dead brother's wife, or do chalitza, which is a ceremony in which he basically rejects her and decides not to marry her. But we say, don't go anywhere, don't do anything, just stay put, and that's the first opinion. That's the opinion in this Mishnah. Basically saying, right, don't do anything, because until the older brother, the implication is until the older brother has decided whether or not he wants to marry her, this other brother has sort of an equal obligation to marry her. Rashi has a long explanation, but I think I'm not going to read all of it to you. Right, so the brother either has to marry her or do chalitza, decide not to marry her. This is basically what it's saying. When you have the two brothers, we'll say that there are just two brothers, and the third brother has died, and now this woman is left. They are each sort of quasi-married to this woman who was the wife of their late brother. They're each sort of supposed to marry her, and so they can't marry somebody else. They can't move forward with marriage to someone else. It's a forbidden relationship because they're kind of supposed to marry her. And the flip side, of course, the other opinion in this Mishnah would be no. He could move forward with the marriage because he's not actually married, right? It's just he could choose to marry the wife of his late brother, but he doesn't have to. And so the flip side would be that the brother can actually proceed with his engagement and marry the woman. Anyway, the point is that Shmuel holds like Yehuda ben Betera, Amar Shmuel halacha kerbi Yehuda ben Betera. And this again just proves that Shmuel generally holds by the more restrictive minority opinion. That's apparently how he holds in this Mishnah, and therefore we can conclude that Shmuel above, in the machloket that we actually do care about, that Shmuel holds that we accept Rav Bivi's version, and so Shmuel holds like the stricter opinion, and if you stopped for a long enough amount of time, long enough to read the whole Megillah, you would actually have to go back to the beginning, whereas Rav holds that you would not have to go back to the beginning no matter how long you waited. Generally speaking, in matters of ritual, we hold like Rav, so presumably we paskin that no matter how long you wait, if you're starting and stopping, you don't have to go back to the beginning of the Megillah, but Shmuel would say that you do if you waited long enough. Okay, the Gemara is moving on. Tani Rabbanan, here's a new brayta. Hishmit ba sofer otiot opsukin, v'karan hakoreh k'miturgaman. If the sofer, if the scribe left out letters or verses, hishmit is left out, skipped letters or verses, meaning in the Megillah, v'karan hakoreh k'miturgaman, and the reader read them as a translator, hamitargem yatsa, then the translator is yotze. Rashi explains k'miturgaman, hamitargem, Rashi says al peh. This means that just like a translator would have to do it on the fly, the guy who's reading had to fill it in by heart. So you're reading along in the Megillah and you notice that a verse is missing, but you know it by heart, so you recite it anyway. In that case, the Braita says you're yotze. Meitzveh, we bring a contradiction from a different Braita. Hayuba otiyot metushashot o mekuraot, im rishuman mikar kshera v'im lav psula. So if you had, if within the Megillah, Hayuba, there are within it, in this case the Megillah, letters that are kind of worn out, partially erased, omikoroot, or they're sort of torn off, if their impression is visible, if you can see sort of the outline of them, the impression of them on the cloth, even though the ink isn't actually there, kshera, then it's kosher. V'im lav psula, and if not, it's pasul. So this seems to contradict, because the first one said if you're missing pieces, but you read it anyway, you're good to go, and the second one says you're missing pieces, so it's not kosher. Lo kasha, we resolve this. Ha bechula, ha b'miktzata. So lo kasha, of course, means it's not a problem. This second one, the second braita, so this one is talking about if the whole thing is like that, right? The whole thing is worn out, the whole thing is sort of torn up like that, that's a problem. Ha b'miktzata, but the first one is talking about just a small amount, right? It's just missing a few letters here and there, a few verses here and there. So that's the difference, and that's why it's not a contradiction. Tana Rabbanan, one last braita. Hishmit baha koreh pasuk echad, lo yomar ekra et kula v'achar kach ekra oto pasuk. If the reader skipped a single verse, Hishmit baha koreh pasuk echad, he shouldn't say to himself, Ekra et kula, okay, I'll read the whole rest of the Megillah, and then afterwards I'll read that pasuk, right? I'll finish the Megillah, and then I'll read that pasuk, I'll fill in that pasuk. Ella koreme oto pasuk ve'elach. Rather, you have to read from that pasuk moving forward, meaning you have to, you skipped a pasuk, so you go back to that pasuk, read it, and then read the rest of the Megillah from there. Nichnas lebeit hakneset umatzah tzibur shekaru chatzia. If you went into shul and found that the congregation had already read half of the Megillah, lo yomar, you can't say to yourself, or you should not say to yourself, ekra chatzia im hatzibur v'achar kach ekra chatzia. I'll read, half, meaning the second half, with the congregation, and then I'll go back and read the first half. You're not allowed to do that. Ella koreo tam mitchilata v'ad sofa. Rather, you have to read it from beginning to end. So same theme in both parts of this braita. You have to always make sure to read in order, and if there's some kind of skipping going on, you have to skip back to the part that you skipped, and then read going forward. Okay, we'll stop there.